Jung's insights into the unconscious often began not with abstract philosophy, but with his close observation of how ordinary people lived their daily lives, repeating habits that drained their vitality without realizing it. One of his most striking discoveries was that the environments people spend their time in are not neutral backdrops, but active forces shaping the mind, sometimes in destructive ways. These environments are not always physical rooms or locations, but psychological spaces, mental traps that condition our thoughts, emotions, and even our sense of identity. Jung saw that 90% of a person's mental strength could be slowly eroded by these invisible traps, leaving them anxious, exhausted, and lost, even when they seem to have everything in order on the surface. What makes this particularly insidious is that people often blame themselves for their suffering, not realizing that the environment they are immersed in is working against them like a hidden toxin. In the early 1960s, Jung treated a patient who appeared to live a normal, even respectable, life, but who was gradually unraveling mentally. Jung traced his decline not to trauma, or a single event, but to the 7 psychological environments he inhabited daily, each of which subtly reshaped his mind in ways that weakened him. By identifying and escaping these spaces, the man transformed completely, a process Jung documented as proof of how environmental psychology could either destroy or liberate a person's psyche. The first of these spaces, and arguably the most dangerous, is what Jung described as the echo chamber. The echo chamber is not just a group of like-minded people agreeing on ideas. It is a psychological vacuum where every opinion, belief, and fear is mirrored back at you until you mistake it for universal truth. Jung noticed his patients spending hours in social clubs and political gatherings, where the conversation never varied, the same complaints, the same criticisms, the same worldview, recycled endlessly. What seemed at first like fellowship was actually indoctrination, and the patient could no longer tell the difference between his own authentic thought and the collective voice of the group. Modern neuroscience has confirmed Jung's observation. When your brain is never challenged, your neural pathways weaken, much like muscles that atrophy from lack of exercise. The mind thrives on friction, on testing, and refining ideas against resistance, but in an echo chamber, questioning becomes dangerous, even a kind of betrayal. Jung called this collective possession the moment when group thinking takes over, and individual thought dissolves. The danger here is not just intellectual stagnation, but psychological fragility. When every conversation reinforces your worldview, you become incapable of handling difference. A single alternative perspective can feel like a personal attack, which explains why people in echo chambers often become defensive, hostile, or paranoid when confronted with new information. You can recognize the echo chamber in your own life when your conversations feel scripted, when you can predict what everyone around you will say on any given topic, when you stop asking yourself whether you might be wrong. At first, this environment offers comfort, a sense of belonging and certainty, but over time it makes the mind smaller, more fearful, and more dependent on the group for validation. Jung saw his patient shrink into this pattern, mistaking conformity for truth and, in the process, losing the ability to think independently. The tragedy is that echo chambers masquerade as safety while quietly draining the individual of resilience. In today's world, these spaces are more pervasive than ever, amplified by digital algorithms that feed us content designed to match our existing preferences. Social media platforms have turned the echo chamber into a global psychological trap, where millions of people scroll through curated feeds that confirm their biases, while insulating them from difference. The cost of this is profound. Societies polarize, friendships fracture, and individuals lose touch with their authentic voice. Yet Jung also understood that identifying the trap is the first step toward freedom. Escaping an echo chamber requires cultivating intellectual humility, and deliberately seeking out perspectives that make you uncomfortable. This is not about agreeing with every opposing view, but about reawakening the critical faculties that stagnate when left unused. Neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman's research shows that when the brain encounters unexpected information, it activates regions responsible for learning and adaptation. In other words, discomfort is the fuel of growth. Jung would argue that the task of individuation, his central psychological project, cannot proceed inside an echo chamber, because individuation requires becoming distinct from the collective, shaping an identity that is not borrowed, but discovered. The patient who had been so deeply immersed in his group's rigid thinking began to heal only when he limited his exposure to those gatherings, and deliberately sought conversations with people who saw the world differently. At first, this made him anxious and defensive, but over time it expanded his inner world, teaching him to hold complexity without collapsing into fear. The echo chamber illustrates Jung's broader principle: psychological environments are not passive. They mold us, strengthen us, or weaken us. The mind is porous, absorbing not just information, but atmosphere, tone, and unspoken assumptions. This is why Jung insisted that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The unconscious here is not just a storehouse of repressed memories, but the invisible influence of the spaces you inhabit daily. Spend long enough in a toxic environment, and your unconscious begins to replicate its patterns, even when you are alone. This is why leaving an echo chamber feels so difficult. The patterns follow you internally until you consciously overwrite them. One of the subtle dangers Jung highlighted is that echo chambers do not simply maintain your existing views, they intensify them. When no one challenges you, you drift toward extremes, becoming more certain, more rigid, and more incapable of nuance. This process does not just harm individuals. It destabilizes communities. Collective possession, as Jung described it, is the seedbed of mass movements, moral panics, and ideological crusades, where people lose themselves in the certainty of the group, and commit actions they would never consider alone. To resist this requires courage, the courage to stand apart, to endure misunderstanding, and to accept the loneliness that sometimes comes with authentic thought. But Jung believed that this was the price of psychological sovereignty, the freedom to think and live from one's own center rather than the borrowed convictions of the collective. Modern psychology adds another layer of urgency. Chronic exposure to echo chambers, whether in person or online, floods the brain with stress hormones like cortisol whenever opposing views appear, because the nervous system has been trained to perceive them as threats. Over time, this constant state of hypervigilance erodes mental health, leading to anxiety, burnout, and even cognitive decline. The very environment designed to provide belonging ends up hollowing out resilience, leaving people fragile in the face of difference. Jung's patient described this experience vividly: what began as companionship turned into dependency, and what felt like certainty turned into paranoia. It was only when he stepped outside the echo chamber that he realized how small his world had become. The lesson here is as practical as it is profound. If you want to safeguard your mental strength, you must monitor not only what you consume, but where you consume it. Every environment is a training ground for the mind, either sharpening or dulling its edges. Jung would argue that the question to ask is not whether an environment feels comfortable, but whether it challenges you toward growth. Comfort without challenge is the soil of decay. As individuals, we must cultivate diverse psychological ecosystems surrounding ourselves, with people and ideas that stretch us, even when it feels uncomfortable. This is not simply an intellectual exercise, but a survival strategy, because the echo chamber is only the first of 7 environments that can dismantle the psyche. By escaping it, you prepare yourself to face the next trap with resilience rather than fragility. If the echo chamber erodes individuality by drowning us in sameness, the second psychological environment Jung identified attacks the psyche from a different angle, the relentless arena of comparison. While the echo chamber offers the illusion of safety in conformity, comparison transforms life into a stage where every act, every possession, and every achievement is measured against others. Jung recognized that this constant measuring is not a harmless social instinct, but a corrosive force that fragments the self, leaving individuals perpetually dissatisfied and alienated from their inner truth. The patient Jung studied often returned from gatherings not only echoing the group's ideas, but also crushed by the weight of not measuring up. He compared his income to others, his house, his appearance, his children's accomplishments, even his posture at the dinner table. What struck Jung was that the man did not realize these comparisons were learned behaviors. They were absorbed from a culture that conditioned him to believe worth is only visible through contrast. If the echo chamber told him what to think, the arena of comparison told him who he was allowed to be. Modern research supports Jung's early intuition. Psychologist Leon Festinger, in his seminal work on social comparison theory, demonstrated that people constantly evaluate themselves in relation to others, and that this mechanism, while useful in some evolutionary contexts, becomes psychologically destructive when left unchecked. Social media has weaponized this instinct, creating a constant stream of curated images and updates that present exaggerated versions of other people's lives. The result is a culture of perpetual inadequacy, where individuals cannot rest in their own accomplishments, because there is always someone else who appears to be doing better. Jung's patient experienced this decades before the digital age, but the mechanism was identical. He lived in a neighborhood where every lawn, every car, every dinner party became an unspoken competition. Without realizing it, he was bleeding vitality into the endless contest. Comparison is insidious because it attaches itself to identity. Instead of asking what do I want, what fulfills me, the individual asks, how do I rank? How do I appear? Jung observed that this external orientation disconnects a person from their inner compass, leading to chronic anxiety. When the self is defined by others, it becomes fragile because others are always changing. The patient would feel proud of his progress one moment, only to be thrown into despair the next, when someone else surpassed him. This constant shifting created what Jung described as psychic instability, a restless state that prevented genuine growth. The deeper danger of comparison is that it makes authenticity feel like failure. If you follow your own path, it will almost certainly diverge from the collective scoreboard, and in the arena of comparison, divergence is punished. Jung argued that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, requires stepping outside of this arena entirely. Authenticity cannot be measured by external standards. It emerges from alignment between conscious life and the deeper currents of the unconscious. But comparison blinds people to those inner currents, replacing intuition with envy and imitation. The man Jung treated described feeling like a ghost in his own life. He was busy, constantly striving, but he no longer recognized himself. This description is hauntingly familiar. Today, many live with the same disconnection, their days consumed by striving toward benchmarks they did not choose. Promotions, possessions, follower counts all serve as metrics in the great comparison game. Yet beneath the surface lies exhaustion, because living by comparison is a form of exile from the self. Jung did not dismiss comparison entirely. He recognized that in moderation it can inspire growth by providing models and challenges. But he warned that once comparison dominates the psyche, it becomes tyrannical. The antidote he suggested was not withdrawal from society, but recentering the self. He encouraged his patient to keep a journal where he recorded not his achievements relative to others, but the moments when he felt genuine vitality, moments of curiosity, creativity, or simple contentment. Over time, this practice reconnected the man with his inner compass, teaching him to value authenticity over ranking. Modern neuroscience echoes this wisdom. Studies on intrinsic motivation show that people who pursue goals aligned with personal meaning experience higher well-being than those who pursue goals based on comparison or status. The brain releases dopamine not only when we achieve external rewards, but also when we engage in activities that feel inherently fulfilling. This suggests that the psyche is wired for authenticity, and comparison is a distortion that hijacks this natural system. What makes comparison particularly toxic is its endlessness. In an echo chamber, you can at least step out, and hear different voices. In comparison, there is no exit, because there is always someone richer, smarter, more attractive, more accomplished. Jung's patient described it as running a race with no finish line, a race where exhaustion is the only certainty. Jung believed that until one recognizes the futility of this contest, the psyche will remain trapped in a cycle of striving and despair. One striking insight Jung offered was that comparison often masks envy, and envy itself is a disguised longing for wholeness. When we envy another's talent or success, we are often glimpsing a part of ourselves that has been repressed or neglected. If we can reinterpret envy not as shame, but as information, an arrow pointing to unlived potential, we can reclaim it as a guide rather than a poison. For Jung, this reframing transformed comparison from a trap into a doorway toward individuation. The patient, for example, envied his neighbor's artistic skill. Instead of shaming himself for the envy, he began painting privately, discovering a wellspring of joy that had been buried for years. Comparison is thus not simply destructive. It is revelatory if approached with consciousness. It shows us where we have abandoned parts of ourselves in order to chase approval. It reveals where we are living by borrowed values rather than authentic desires. Jung's central message was that the task of the psyche is not to win the comparison game, but to leave the arena altogether, stepping into a life measured not by rankings, but by depth. In today's hyper-connected world, Jung's insight has never been more urgent. Comparison is no longer limited to neighbors or colleagues. It is global, relentless, and algorithmically intensified. Every scroll through a feed is a silent invitation into the arena, and, without awareness, we enter it hundreds of times a day. The cost is enormous. Rising rates of anxiety, depression, and burnout are not merely personal failings, but symptoms of a culture addicted to comparison. Escaping this trap is not easy, but it is necessary for psychological sovereignty. It begins with small acts of rebellion, turning off the scoreboard, refusing to measure yourself by numbers, and listening instead to the quiet voice within. Jung's patient, once tormented by inadequacy, found freedom not by surpassing his peers, but by rediscovering his own rhythm. He painted, he walked in nature, he began to savor moments that could not be ranked. Slowly his anxiety lessened, and his vitality returned. What had once been a suffocating arena of comparison became an opportunity to uncover neglected parts of himself. His story illustrates the profound truth that liberation is not about winning the contest, but about realizing you were never meant to run it. The arena of comparison, like the echo chamber, is one of the 7 environments Jung warned about. Together, they reveal how easily the psyche can be colonized by forces outside itself, but they also reveal the path of resistance, conscious awareness, authentic living, and the courage to step outside the invisible walls of conformity and competition. By refusing to measure life through borrowed metrics, we reclaim the energy to build a self that is not fragile, but whole. The shadow reveals itself when we project disowned qualities onto others, but Jung argued that projection is only one side of the story. The other side emerges when the carefully constructed mask, the persona, begins to crack under pressure. If projection shows what we are unwilling to admit, persona breakdown shows how desperately we try to protect the false image we present to the world. Together, these two phenomena form what Jung saw as twin gateways into the authentic self. The patient Jung described often spoke proudly of his ability to maintain composure. He wore his social role like armor, always courteous, always professional, always well prepared. To his colleagues and friends he appeared calm and reliable, a man immune to agitation. But Jung noticed something telling: the more the man boasted of his composure, the more brittle it seemed in sessions. Whenever his competence or character was gently questioned, a flash of defensiveness would surface, an edge in the voice, a tightening around the mouth, a sudden rush to change the subject. These subtle cracks revealed that the persona, however polished, was exhausting to maintain. Jung defined the persona as the social mask, the compromise between individual needs and collective expectations. It is not inherently false. Everyone must adapt to society, and a functional persona allows us to participate in the world. But trouble arises when the mask fuses with identity. When people mistake the persona for the self, they become fragile because any challenge to the mask feels like an attack on their very being. Jung observed this fragility countless times: patients who erupted in anger when their virtues were doubted, who collapsed in despair when their image faltered, or who clung obsessively to roles that no longer fit them. The patient's life illustrated this with painful clarity. In social gatherings he cultivated the image of the ever-capable man, admired for his knowledge and composure. Yet the moment someone pointed out a flaw, or offered criticism, his mask slipped. He became defensive, sometimes even bitter, retreating into silence, or counter-attacking. Jung realized that this reaction was not about the criticism itself, but about the man's fear of being exposed. He had over-identified with the persona, so when it cracked, he felt as though he himself were breaking apart. In modern psychology, this phenomenon is sometimes described as ego fragility, or image maintenance. Research on self-discrepancy theory by Edward Torrey Higgins shows that, when there is a gap between the actual self and the ideal self we project, we experience intense discomfort. This discomfort often manifests as defensiveness, anxiety, or hostility when the persona is challenged. Jung saw this decades earlier, and he understood that the mask both protects and suffocates. It allows us to function socially, but prevents us from being real. The persona breakdown is most visible under stress. In moments of pressure, public failure, humiliation, or deep disappointment, the mask cannot hold. Jung recounted how, in critical moments, his patient's calm exterior would shatter, his voice would rise, his hands would shake, and his face would flush. These eruptions, while embarrassing to the patient, fascinated Jung. He saw them not as failures, but as revelations, windows into the underlying truth. The authentic self was breaking through the veneer. This is why Jung valued persona breakdowns. They are moments when the false self is stripped away, however briefly, revealing the shadow and the deeper psyche beneath. He believed that if a person could face these moments with honesty rather than denial, they could begin the process of individuation. The problem, of course, is that most people rush to repair the mask as quickly as possible, patching the cracks, instead of examining what lies behind them. To illustrate this, Jung offered analogies. He compared the persona to clothing. We need clothes to live in society, but if we never take them off, we forget the texture of our own skin. Or he likened the persona to a stage costume. The actor must wear it to play the role, but confusion arises when the actor forgets that the role is temporary, and believes the costume is his true self. Jung's patient had so fused with his costume of composure that he feared any deviation from it would mean annihilation. The relevance today is striking. Social media encourages us to polish and maintain personas more intensely than any previous era. Online profiles become curated masks, carefully edited to present the most admirable image. The fear of breakdown is everywhere. People delete posts after criticism, scramble to defend reputations, and live in constant anxiety of exposure. Jung's insights anticipate this condition perfectly. He would say that the problem is not the existence of the mask, but the over-identification with it. We forget that the mask is only a tool, not the truth. Yet Jung also emphasized compassion in these breakdown moments. He saw that beneath the mask lies vulnerability. The patient's defensiveness was not arrogance, but fear of rejection, fear of inadequacy, fear of being unworthy of love. Jung encouraged him to explore these fears rather than deny them. By doing so, the patient gradually learned that the collapse of the mask was not the collapse of himself. Instead, it was an invitation to discover who he was without the costume. One of Jung's great contributions was to show that the authentic self is not fragile. The persona may shatter, but the deeper psyche endures. In fact, breakdowns often mark the beginning of integration. When the mask falters, the shadow, and the true self have a chance to emerge. For the patient, this realization was liberating. He began to see his outbursts not as humiliations, but as signals. They pointed to areas where his identity was overinvested in appearance rather than reality. In therapeutic practice today, moments of persona breakdown are often called ruptures. Far from being setbacks, they are opportunities for growth if handled with awareness. Jung pioneered this view, teaching that the goal is not to eliminate the persona, but to hold it lightly, to wear it when needed, remove it when safe, and never mistake it for the essence of the soul. The patient eventually came to recognize this in one striking example. After a tense exchange at work, he admitted in therapy that he felt both ashamed and strangely relieved. The mask had cracked, and instead of rushing to repair it, he reflected on why criticism wounded him so deeply. This act of reflection marked the beginning of individuation. He was no longer enslaved by the mask. He was learning to step outside it. The lesson Jung drew is timeless. True strength is not found in maintaining an unbroken mask, but in facing the self that emerges when the mask falls away. Persona breakdown is not the end of identity. It is the beginning of authenticity.